The USS Indianapolis Incident. On July 26, 1945, the crew of the USS Indianapolis had just completed a top-secret mission. They delivered the components of the world's first atomic bomb to the island of Tinian, which only days later would level Hiroshima. The ship's next orders were simple: sail to the Philippines and join the USS Idaho for the final assault on Japan. But on the night of July 30th, the calm ocean was ripped apart by two Japanese torpedoes, slamming in the cruiser's side, splitting it in two. In only 12 minutes, the Indianapolis sank. About 300 men were trapped inside, vanishing into the dark as the ocean swallowed the wreck. Roughly 900 survivors surfaced, but they had no idea their own fate would soon be far worse. Some burned, others bleeding, most coated in oil leaking from the ship. Many had no life jackets or rafts, forced to cling to debris and each other in the black water. They expected rescue within hours. None came. The ship's distress signals had been ignored. As the sun rose, the nightmare began. Beneath the waves, fins appeared. Sharks. At first, they circled from a distance, drawn by the blood and the cries. Then came the screams. The men felt teeth first, then nothing as their legs vanished in a swirl of red. Many were dragged underwater, their life vests surfacing moments later. The attacks continued as the ocean churned red around the drifting survivors. Those who survived the first assaults tried to stay in tight groups, but the currents tore them apart. The sun scorched them by day and dehydration drove many to madness. Some drank seawater and died from saltwater poisoning. 4 days passed. Then, by sheer chance, a patrol bomber spotted an oil slick and the faint shapes of men. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn radioed for help. Of the 1,196 sailors aboard the Indianapolis, only 317 survived. Block 11 was a building inside Auschwitz concentration camp, often called the Death Block. In 1942, a Polish resistance fighter was dragged there after being caught smuggling messages. The SS men accused him of sabotage and sentenced him to the post, a medieval torture known as the strappado. His wrists were tied tightly behind his back with wire, and a pulley was fixed above him. With a single pull, the guards hoisted him into the air until his shoulders gave way with a sharp, wet crack. He was dropped, then lifted again, over and over, each time his arms stretching further, tendons snapping, joints shattering and blood spraying from torn veins in the armpits. The guards whipped his exposed back between hoists until strips of flesh peeled away. The sessions lasted for hours. After 3 days, the man's body was ruined, his arms hanging limp and twisted. On the final day, they raised him one last time, and his neck snapped under the strain. He was one of thousands who suffered inside Block 11. The Ramree Island Incident. In the final years of World War II, British forces set their sights on a remote jungle island off the coast of Burma, Ramree. Their objective was clear: capture the island's airfield and drive the entrenched Japanese garrison out of its dense mangrove swamps. After days of brutal fighting, the Japanese lines finally collapsed. The remaining 1,000 soldiers, surrounded and cut off from supplies, only had one choice: flee into the marshes under the cover of night. But they didn't know that there was something lurking below the waters. The mangroves of Ramree were home to hundreds of 20-foot saltwater crocodiles. As the soldiers waded deeper into the swamp, chaos broke out. British troops stationed along the edges later recalled hearing blood-curdling screams echoing through the darkness, followed by splashes and scattered rifle shots. The crocodiles struck from below, dragging men into the murky depths. Bones snapped, flesh tore, some soldiers were crushed in a single bite, others ripped apart or swallowed whole. By morning, the swamp was eerily quiet, except for one sound: the gnawing on flesh. Vultures had arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left. British patrols found helmets and rifles, trashed Japanese uniforms, and marks of reptilian tails in the mud. Out of 1,000 Japanese soldiers who entered the swamp that night, only 20 were found alive. The event was so grotesque that historians still debate whether it could have happened on such a scale. Many say the screams were from British fire, drownings, and starvation. The Unit 731 Atrocities. Hidden deep in the icy wilderness of Manchuria, a cluster of concrete buildings stood under constant guard. Even whispers of its existence were punishable by death. It was known as Unit 731, Japan's most secret wartime laboratory. Officially, it was a research center for epidemic prevention. Inside one of its frozen operating rooms in 1943, a Chinese farmer accused of sabotage was stripped naked and bound to a steel table. The air was freezing, his breath visible as the surgeons gathered around. Without a trace of anesthesia, they began using the scalpel to observe the progression of plague infection in real time, muffled by the cloth in his mouth as his organs were examined like specimens. The doctors worked methodically. They removed his stomach, clamped his arteries to study blood loss, and even forced air into his veins to watch his body convulse from embolism. Each time he began to fade, they injected stimulants to keep him alive. For 90 unbearable minutes, the man's body was reduced to a living experiment. When it was over, his remains were discarded like waste. He was just one of over 14,000 victims who met the same fate. Their suffering fueled the creation of weapons that would later unleash disease and death across Asia. The Bari harbor disaster. By the winter of 1943, the Allied forces in Italy were struggling to push north. The Germans had dug in, and even though Italy had surrendered and switched sides, the fighting continued. The Allies believed they held a crucial advantage though, that the Luftwaffe was too worn down to launch any serious counterattack. It was a fatal assumption. Bari had become the lifeline of the British 8th Army. Its port was crammed with ships, ammunition and men, the heart of Allied logistics in southern Italy. The town itself was packed with over 200,000 people, fuel trucks and hospital supplies. Yet, despite its importance, Bari was virtually defenseless. Only one anti-aircraft battery stood watch, and warnings from officers about its vulnerability went unheeded. On the evening of December 2nd, 1943, the harbor was packed tighter than ever. 30 ships loaded with ammunition, vehicles and fuel anchored side by side. Overhead, a German reconnaissance plane passed unnoticed. As night fell, the roar of engines filled the sky. More than 100 German bombers descended from the darkness. Within minutes, the harbor turned into an inferno. One by one, ships were struck and ignited, ammunition detonating in a chain of thunderous blasts. Then came the most devastating explosion of all, the SS John Harvey, which had been carrying a classified cargo of 2,000 mustard gas bombs. The bombs ruptured as the ship went up in flames, sending a toxic cloud of sulfur vapor rolling into the city. Men jumped into the water to escape the fires, unaware that the sea itself was now filled with poison. Within hours, hundreds were coughing, blistered and blind. By morning, the port of Bari was unrecognizable. 27 ships had been sunk and thousands were dead. The once busy harbor had become a floating graveyard, earning the nickname Little Pearl Harbor. The truth about what caused so many of the mysterious burns and deaths was buried under secrecy. Allied commanders feared public outrage and kept the mustard gas cargo hidden from official reports. The French tank encounter. In spring 1940, German armored divisions surged through the Ardennes, advancing towards the English Channel. On their way was the small French village of Stein, strategically important on a high plateau. Fighting there was fierce. The village changed hands 17 times during the Battle of Stein. Dawn broke over the burning ruins of Stein on May 16th. The air was filled with soot, the streets full of debris from 2 days of fighting. A German column, around 50 soldiers strong, advanced cautiously through the haze. Rifles strapped, convinced the French had finally fled. The village was barely more than a few narrow lanes, lined with shattered walls and burning timbers. Visibility was poor, but the Germans thought they had defeated the weak French, and reinforcements were on the way anyway. Then, as the smoke thinned, a hulking silhouette emerged just some meters ahead of them. Out of the grey fog loomed the massive 30-ton French Char B-1 tank, commanded by Captain Pierre Billotte. The Germans froze in terror, recognizing that their anti-tank weapons weren't set up. Then they panicked, shooting orders and fumbling for their weapons, but there was nowhere to go. The super narrow road trapped them between their own barricades and the advancing tank. Some tried to run, slipping on gravel and their comrades, but the tank kept going forward. its treads grinding over rifles, helmets, and bodies. The horrifying sound of crushing steel, squelching flesh, wet pops of bones, and muffled screams filled the village. When the tank emerged from the other side of the street, it left only silence and blood in its wake. Bilot pressed on, destroying 2 German tanks. Ston wasn't fully occupied until May 25th. The Bataan Death March. In April 1942, after months of desperate fighting on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, over 70,000 exhausted American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. Starved, diseased, and dehydrated, they were forced into what became known as the Bataan Death March, a 70-mile trek through tropical heat that would claim thousands of lives. The prisoners were herded from the Marivilles area toward Camp O'Donnell, given almost no food or water, and beaten for even glancing at roadside wells. Anyone who fell behind or tried to flee was bayoneted, shot, beheaded, or left to die in the dust. Others were crushed beneath trucks or buried alive. Many prisoners also contracted diseases, due to the lack of bathroom breaks, forcing them to go in their pants. When they reached San Fernando, they were crammed into sweltering boxcars meant for 40 men, but packed with over 100. Dozens suffocated in the heat before the train reached Capaz, where the march continued over 8 miles to the gates of Camp O'Donnell. There, thousands succumbed to disease and starvation in makeshift barracks, their suffering concealed from the world until 1944. Admiral Takijirō Ōnishi. On August 16, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender, Admiral Takijirō Ōnishi, remembered as the father of kamikaze, took responsibility in the only way he believed he could. The architect of Japan's suicide squadrons, he had personally ordered thousands of young pilots to crash their planes into Allied ships during the final desperate months of the war. In his quiet home in Tokyo, Ōnishi prepared for ritual seppuku. He wrote a final note apologizing to the families of the men he had sent to die. Then, in a deliberate act of penance, he drove his blade into his abdomen, disemboweling himself, and refused an assistant who would traditionally end his pain with a swift beheading. The wound was deep, but not immediately fatal. As the night dragged on, he lay in silence, bleeding out slowly. His death was so prolonged that even his aides fainted from the smell and sight. He suffered for nearly 15 hours before succumbing at dawn. The Okinawa Pillbox. Amid the final stages of the Battle of Okinawa in June 1945, the island's once green ridges had become a wasteland of shattered rock and smoke. Japanese troops dug deep into fortified tombs and concrete pillboxes, fought to the last breath as American Marines closed in. In one such pillbox, a Japanese sergeant and 3 others waited in suffocating darkness, surrounded by the echoes of battle. They had fended off grenades and gunfire for hours, until silence fell. A silence broken only by the hiss of something new. From the narrow firing slit, a burst of fire erupted, spewing a liquid flame that clung to everything it touched. Within seconds, the confined chamber became a furnace, reaching temperatures that turned metal to liquid and air to poison. The men inside convulsed as the jellied fuel devoured oxygen, their uniforms fusing to their skin, eyes bursting like grapes, while their lungs scorched with every breath. The roar lasted only moments, but what followed was far worse, a choking stillness filled with the stench of burning flesh. Across Okinawa, scenes like this played out endlessly. Hidden caves and bunkers became fiery tombs, sealing thousands of soldiers inside. By the time the battle ended, more than 150,000 soldiers and civilians lay dead. The Eastern Front was swallowed by winter at the end of 1941. When temperatures plunged below -30 degrees, the land itself became an executioner. Wounded soldiers left in open trenches froze solid overnight. Some were found half buried in snow, rifles fused to their hands, faces locked in silent screams. The slow freezing process caused their skin to split and blood to crystallize in their veins. During the retreat from Moscow, one German infantryman collapsed in the snow, his boots frozen to his feet, skin black from frostbite. Medics dragged him into a barn, a makeshift field hospital where there was no morphine, no heat, just tools. They called it salvage surgery. He was tied to a support beam as they poured boiling snow water over his legs and began to saw. The bone cracked like ice beneath the steel. Each cut took 20 minutes per foot. His cries mixed with the wind outside until his voice gave out completely. Infection finished him hours later, sepsis burning from within. By the time the German army withdrew, frostbite had claimed more lives than enemy fire. Among 775,000 German winter casualties, these frostbite surgeries were common. The Falaise Pocket. In August 1944, the fields of Normandy became a slaughterhouse. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, caught between converging Allied forces, were trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. By the evening of August 21st, the pocket had been sealed, with 50,000 Germans trapped inside. Allied bombers started raining down phosphorus charges on columns of retreating men and vehicles. Within hours, the narrow country roads turned into rivers of fire and twisted metal. Tank crews that survived the first blasts found themselves entombed in their own armor. When the phosphorus seeped inside, it clung to skin and refused to stop burning, eating faces in seconds. The heat ignited shells and fuel, turning every hit vehicle into a pressure cooker of fire and steel. Trapped inside tanks, they burned alive. When the smoke cleared days later, recovery teams found the remains of men fused to their seats, their helmets welded to the walls by molten brass. By the time the bombs fell silent, the German army in Normandy was destroyed, tens of thousands dead or captured, hundreds of tanks reduced to smoldering wrecks. What had begun as an orderly withdrawal ended in annihilation. Even weeks later, the air still reeked of death.